Hey everyone, welcome to the May 14th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I am David Aragona, rejoined by my usual co-host Craig Milkowski. Big thank you to Mike Beer for joining me on the forecast last week. But Craig, happy to have you back as the Triple Crown is already halfway done, nearly, as we're looking ahead to the Preakness this week. It feels like we just finished talking about the Kentucky Derby, but that's always the case. That week in between always goes by in a flash, and suddenly it's Preakness week, and we will be looking ahead to the second draw of the Triple Crown later in this podcast, but we're going to try to make this into a little bit of a combo Pacecast forecast, beginning with a recap of some races from last weekend when I know were doing some other things, Craig, but we'll zip through some of those races from Belmont at the Big A, as well as Churchill, Santa Anita, and Monmouth. And then in the second half of this podcast, we'll talk about the Preakness a little bit.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the Preakness, but first we'll recap these races. I mentioned off stage here that I hadn't really watched any of these races. I did make the figures for most of them, but all of them were pretty straightforward this time, so there wasn't any reason to go watch replays. But luckily, if you're watching on YouTube, I'll be able to watch the races along with you as we talk about them.
Exactly. We'll be sharing the screen to talk about some of these speed figures and some of the things that transpired in the replays that we'll take a look at from the last week. Obviously, most of the major racing did take place at Belmont at the Big A. They had that big Saturday card that we talked about on the forecast last week. 4 stakes races, actually 4 graded stakes races, topped by the Man of War and the Peter Pan. We'll go through those. Some big performances, though, at other venues, particularly a noteworthy horse making a return at Churchill Downs that we'll talk about a little bit later in the podcast, and a big speed figure earned by a 3-year-old out in Southern California. So we'll dive into all of those races. And like I said, at the end, we'll try to spend as much time as we can dissecting the Preakness stakes. Obviously, not nearly as much to go through as that Kentucky Derby field. And I think we talked about the 22 horses for verging on 90 minutes, Craig. I don't think the 9-horse Preakness is going to take us nearly that long, but still, I think it came up a pretty interesting Preakness. I know there's been a lot of discussion on social media this week about changing the date of the race and how the Preakness is coming up so much weaker than the Kentucky Derby. I feel like the Preakness always comes up a slightly weaker race than the Kentucky Derby. It's just to be expected. And I actually think that this year's Preakness came up a pretty interesting race that's kind of in line with what we typically see in Preaknesses in recent years.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I was kind of out of the loop this week being away from my daughter's graduation. So, I had just been reading before we went how it was going to be a bad Preakness and maybe Mystic Dan wasn't even going to go. So when I got back and saw the draw and the PPs on Monday, I was pleasantly surprised. I mean, not only did we get Mystic Dan, we got a pretty strong field in there of good. It's probably a better Preakness than what we've seen in the last few years.
Well, we'll get to some of the Preakness talk in a little bit, but let's start with our recap of last weekend's racing, and I'll share my screen to talk about some of this racing from Belmont at the Big A. Beginning with the 7th race, it was the Grade 2 Man of War. Mile and 3/8 the distance. Typically this race run at Belmont Park, but all of these races during the spring meet transferred to Aqueduct this year during the Belmont at the Big A meeting, Craig. Doesn't seem to matter much to Charlie Appleby which American track he's competing at, because he's always dangerous when he ships over these European turf horses. And he had a couple of high profile runners in this race. Nation's Pride, the one that attracted most of the support, getting bet down to 4-5. But just like in the Elkhorn that Silver Knot won a month earlier, he was the other Appleby that day. And once again, he gets the victory as being the second-ranked Appleby by the bettors in the Man of War.
Yeah, and I mean, not only did he get the victory, he did it with a huge TimeformUS speed figure of 128. Went in by 4.5 lengths. Just a really powerhouse performance. I know we had talked about when he won the Elkhorn that maybe Charlie Appleby finally figured out that this is a horse who wants to go longer, and longer he went and did so very capably. And this horse seems to have found a new lease on life with that added third turn that we haven't seen a lot of. So looking forward to see where he shows up next, because he seems to have really turned a corner this year as a 4-year-old with that added distance. And he's a gelding, so I imagine we're going to be seeing a lot of him.
Yeah, and I want to show the early part of this Man of War, because the field got really strung out in the early stages by that long shot leader So High, who tends to do this to his fields. He goes a little bit too quickly for this distance, and often he pays the price, but he can also take a lot of other horses out of their best game and out of their comfort zone. And that might have been the case for Nation's Pride, Craig, who, watching this race in real time, I was surprised to see Frankie Dettori stick as close to So High as he did. And Nation's Pride just seemed a little bit more aggressive than maybe you would have been expecting expecting in the opening half mile of this race. But I mean, Nation so high when we take a look at the chart again, he was earning pace figures in the high 160s for the early part of this race. And obviously, those numbers tend to go a little higher in the marathons with greater variance of how the paces can transpire. But still, it was a pretty fast pace for this distance. And I think Nation's Pride might have been just sitting a little bit too close to it. And Silver Knot just was in the better situation, using his stablemate as the one that he could track maybe a couple lengths further back of that hot pace, and just seemed to really get the distance. Like you were saying, this horse was good last year. He was competitive with what I thought was a very strong group of 3-year-old turf horses back in 2023, but the added distance has really brought out his stamina. I talked about it. I think Marcus Hirsch was on the week that we handicapped the Elkhorn, and we both noted the stamina in Silver Knot's pedigree, but weren't smart enough to actually pick him that day. But I mean, he's a horse who's out of a dam, who was a Group 2 winner in England, going 14 and a half furlongs over 1.75 miles. So definitely have the stamina to ultimately pan out to be this kind of horse. And he's showing it on the racetrack, because the way that he finishes off this race here, Craig, after tracking that fast pace, it's pretty impressive stuff.
Yeah, very impressive. It's not like he was way in the back of the pack. I mean, he was kind of tracking his stablemate. And I thought he was much the best. Yes, I think you could give a little bit of an excuse to Nation's Pride for being too close to the pace. But had they run side by side in the early parts of the race, I would still give the edge to Silver Knot. I think he was just the better horse on this day. Maybe that cost Nation's Pride second. But the runner-up, Ohana Honor, we had saw him win with a huge 123 TimeformUS speed figure at Keeneland, I think it was, in an allowance race. And he kind of backed that up here, running another big, fast race. So he's pretty good as well. Maybe a little bit lucky to get second, but again, it's not like he was way back either. I mean, the 2, 3, 4 horses finished 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, I know that was a number we had some debate about over email at Keeneland when Ohana Honor ran that 123. I think we knocked that down a little bit from the original number you had given him, but he ran a fast race that day. And like you said, he kind of backed it up here, because this was a Group 2 race, but kind of was near Grade 1 quality, given the speed figure that the winner earned and what we've seen from Silver Knot and Nation's Pride in the past. I know the Manowar was recently downgraded from its prior Grade 1 status, but this was a pretty strong field, and I think we're going to see Silver Knot be a major player in Grade 1 races in this division later on if Charlie Appleby does indeed keep him in the U.S., and it sounds like he plans to have a string in the U.S. for the entire year. So you would imagine this horse fits the American program pretty well, going these longer distances.
Yeah, and just to show I never take it personally when you question a speed figure, I had already totally forgotten about it. I remember it now that you said it, and it looks pretty good when he pairs up the number. So I'm glad that we did knock it down a little bit.
Let's move on to another one of the graded stakes events from that Saturday card at Belmont at the Big A. The 6th race was the Grade 3 Peter Pan, the traditional New York prep for the Belmont Stakes, being 4 weeks prior to that third jewel of the Triple Crown. And I think we're probably going to see at least one starter coming out of this Peter Pan pointing to the Belmont, Craig, and that is the winner, Antiquarian, a horse that got a late start to his career in January. He was competing in that fast maiden race that was won, I believe, by Conquest Warrior. Came back and got the job done at Fairgrounds, tried the Louisiana Derby. That turned out to be a tough spot, but he also broke through the starting gate prior to the running of that race and maybe didn't put forth his A effort that day. And now just the 4th start of his career, and probably not a big surprise that he was able to take another step forward, and seems like a horse that really does appreciate these added distances.
Yeah, if there was one race I wish I would have been paying attention to and could have bet this weekend, it's this one, because I'm nearly certain that I would have liked Antiquarian in here, given that trip that he had in the Louisiana Derby. Not so much a trip, but it wasn't a great trip. He broke through early, as you say, and I just thought this horse was coming out of a much better race. We talked about that Louisiana division of 3-year-olds and how well they've been running, and Antiquarian backed it up, and he backed it up in a big way, coming through with a 118 TimeformUS speed figure, obviously a career high for him, and as good as we've really seen outside of that Florida Derby from Fierceness.
Yeah, the runner-up in this race, the Wine Steward, he's a nice horse who has run some speed figures that are right in range with this in his prior start, as well as at the tail end of his 2-year-old season when he was second in the Breeders' Futurity. So he's kind of a good barometer to use for this field. And the Wine Steward, Craig, might just be a horse that doesn't really want to go much farther than this. I don't view him as one that's going to proceed on to the Belmont Stakes. I haven't yet seen reporting about where Mike Maker is going to target him, but given his prowess sprinting as a 2-year-old, and while he's handled these longer distances, I wonder if he's one that might be more of a miler down the line. So maybe a race like the Woody Stevens on Belmont Day, or even the Mike Lee, since he is a New York bred. I think he's got that option open to him that they run those races, I think, the day after the Belmont Stakes for the New York bred. So we'll see what they do with the Wine Steward. Not that he lost any stature in defeat in this race. I know he went off at 6-5 after Tuscan Gold was scratched. He'll be competing in the Preakness instead, so we'll talk about him shortly. But it did make the Wine Steward the clear horse to beat on paper. Antiquarian just wanted the distance a little bit more and was able to wear him down. I also thought both horses coming out of the Wood Memorial did run slightly better in here. Protective, still a maiden, but picked up another minor award in a graded stakes race. We'll see if Mike Rapoli and Todd Pletcher decide to ever try to break his maiden in a maiden special weight again after running so well in a couple of stakes races. The horse that I guess I don't really know what to do with out of this, Craig, is Deterministic, who ran a little better than in the Wood Memorial when he was beaten as the odds-on favorite, but not so much better that you would view him trying more of these races in the future. And I think they've got to change something up with him.
Yeah, I'm not sure what's up with him. He was a horse who actually ran a really fast race in his comeback. And I remember there was some debate about his speed figure, but you just couldn't use the clock for that one. I settled on a 113, and I guess the speed figure is fine for that race, but he's yet to run back to it in 2 starts. Hasn't looked very good on the track. So it seems like it's back to the drawing board for that one.
Yeah, I was talking about this with Mike on the forecast last week, that maybe if this doesn't work out for Deterministic, I know the connections have toyed around with the idea of turning back in distance. We were both a little interested in seeing this horse get on the turf at some point because he's got plenty of turf pedigree on the dam side. And not that Christophe Clement needs another good turf horse, but this one does seem like he might have that inclination if they wanted to try it. And given these 2 poor performances on the dirt over fast tracks and his big number coming on a wet track in the Gotham, maybe you want to try to find a surface that he appreciates a little bit more, because surface could be the issue with Deterministic. Well, Craig, let's move on to another turf stakes that took place a little bit earlier in the day at Belmont at the Big A. The second race on the card was the Grade 3 Beaugay, and seemed like Chad Brown had a pretty strong hand coming into this race, sending out the top 2 choices in the wagering in 2-5 White Beam and 5-2 Esprit, but they both went down to defeat. White Beam ran well, just got nailed on the wire by Nisi Marie under a perfectly timed ride by Joel Rosario.
Yeah, this one had to be a surprise. There was just a 5-horse field. As you said, the 2 Chad Brown horses took most of the money, but Nisi Marie was able to get the job done. She hadn't really shown this kind of ability before, but she had run pretty well as a 3-year-old. She was making her first start as a 4-year-old, and often we talk about it, particularly on turf. I almost always expect these horses to get better. It seems like it takes them a little bit longer on that surface to run speed figures, to really take that big jump, unlike on the dirt. And she ran a 117 here, so nice forward progression from her. I mean, still, that said, White Beam was running all 120s all of last year. So not sure. I know I saw a tweet about the trip she had, so I'll let you talk about that one a little bit. But at 1-2, you're supposed to get the job done.
Yeah, you could see what's going on in the backstretch here as I show the replay. A little bit surprising that these 2 horses went out as fast as they did. This was another turf race. Surprising to say this in New York, but another turf race that featured an extremely fast pace. And the top 2 in the early stages, they probably were the 2 that ran the best races, as Spirit and Glory clearly came out of the gate under Jose Lozcano trying for the front end. She had earned that easy front-running victory in her prior start in the Plenty of Grace, and the connections apparently trying to replicate that trip, but White Beam was just fresh off the layoff, and Irad Ortiz just kind of dropped his hands and let her go on with it. And these 2 really hooked up in the early stages. And it seemed at this point, as they come to the quarter pole, like maybe they had enough left in the tank to hold on. And it seemed like White Beam would have had the measure of Spirit and Glory at the top of the stretch, but they really threw it down all the way to the finish. And she's not even on the picture right now, but Nisi Marie is going to come flying at the end. As somebody who liked Nisi Marie and better in this race, I was kind of thinking maybe Joel Rosario was waiting too long because he was showing no urgency at the top of the stretch, but he did time it perfectly as those top 2 got very tired in the final 16th, I think justifiably so, because all the pace figures for this race are color-coded in red, Craig.
Yeah, they are. And not just that, as you said, there was pressure. So a little bit different than the So High race. These two were actually dueling up front. Yeah, no argument. The speed figure certainly shows he ran the better race. They both ran in the 120s, 124 for White Beam, even a 125 for Spirit and Glory, getting big pace upgrades here. Maybe had there been other turf races to compare it to, this would be one we downgraded a little bit because of pace, but a little tough to do in this situation. But yeah, I think all the top three ran well. The disappointment had to be the other Chad Brown Asprey, who was coming off a layoff since last summer at Saratoga, winning the Lake Placid. And she really did no running. She had no excuses in here, didn't show up.
Yeah, I mean, just to comment on the ride by Irad on White Beam, I think it's really easy to criticize somebody when they lose on a 2-5 favorite. I will say, if you watch some of White Beam's races, especially in the second half of last year, she was really tough to ride for Flavien Prat. Was a little too keen in her races, especially in that first Lady of Keeneland, was pulling a little bit and just seemed like she resented raiding behind horses, whereas she had handled that early in her career. So with the jockey switch to Irad, I think he was cognizant of not really wanting to grab her and get in a fight with her, and it just resulted in them going a little bit too fast. But like you said, Greg, I mean, with the pace upgrade, she ran her typical speed figure. I think this actually was a positive start to White Beam's campaign. As you were alluding to, not so for a spray. Something caused her to miss the second half of last season because, I mean, she had run her best ever figure in August. And I don't think typically when you see that, it's the plan to miss all of the graded stakes race for 3-year-old fillies in October and November and December. But that's what happened to her. So clearly there was some issue that kept her away. And she just doesn't seem to have come back as the same horse off the layoff. We'll close out the stakes action from New York last weekend with the Grade 3 Run Happy run going 6 furlongs on the dirt right in the middle of this card. And an upset here, Craig, a straight no chaser took the bulk of public support coming off the long layoff. You might remember this horse was very impressive almost exactly a year ago when he won that Maryland Sprint on Preakness Day 2023, getting a 127 TimeformUS speed figure, winning that race by open lengths. Something went wrong after that. I think he failed one of his bone scans, and they gave him a lot of time off following that. Came back off the layoff here. Seemingly was facing a field that he could have handled, Craig, but I'm going to show the start of this race, particularly the head on it. I think you'll see he might have had a mild excuse. Not that you want to make huge excuses for horses at 3-5, but not an ideal beginning for a horse that needs the lead to be successful. And he is the one breaking the rail, as you'll see.
Yeah, not an ideal start for sure. And then he veers pretty sharply to the inside, gets beat to the spot. So, yeah, not a great start for him. And I mean, let's be honest, he had an excuse of he's been off almost a year. He changed barns. Who knows if he's going to come back to be the same horse that we saw last year when he ran that 127 TimeformUS speed figure, taking the Maryland Sprint. He was a horse showing a lot of promise up until then, but impossible to say if he's going to be the same horse. I would imagine with that slate excuse, maybe he'll take money again next time, but I'd probably tread lightly with a horse like this, just expecting him to get back to the numbers he was previously running.
Yeah, and even after stumbling at the start, the number 2 Durante with Manny Franco came over into that, not into his path, but tightened it up on him. I think you're supposed to do that if you're Manny Franco in that situation. When you've got your main rival with speed to the inside and he breaks poorly, you're supposed to tighten things up a little bit. And I thought Manny did that perfectly and made life difficult for straight no chaser. We do have to talk about the winner of this race, though, Craig, the number 6 Joey Freshwater. Just like in his prior start where he scored that allowance victory quite easily, got the same 3-wide stalking trip in here, and it just worked out well for a horse who was in great form right now for Linda Rice.
Yeah, very good form. He had won that last allowance race. You might note he ran a 117 TimeformUS speed figure. His final time that day was a 124 figure. He didn't quite match it on this day, but he was still good enough to get the job done. Good effort by him. Ran another 117 here in this spot. So normally I would say, that's not that strong of a figure for older male sprinters, but it hadn't been exactly a division that shined when it comes to the speed figure department. So who knows? It's wide open, and he's right up there with any that we've really seen.
Yeah, I think he's going to have to face some better horses in the future, especially if the likes of Straight No Chaser doesn't have trouble at the start, or he has to get a tougher trip than he's gotten the last couple of times where things have really gone just perfectly for Joey Freshwater. I think he drew the outside post in both of those starts and was just able to sit perched out there as some others inside of him maybe didn't get ideal trips. So we'll see if he's able to turn out to be a true grade 1 or grade 2 level sprinter. I think he's got a ways to go to get there. And like you said, this race didn't earn a particularly impressive speed figure. I think that's to be expected when the entire field is covered by 3 1/4 lengths. Typically, you want to see a little more separation in a dirt sprint if a race is going to earn a fast speed figure. So not sure that this was the strongest event, probably a true grade 3 affair, which is what it was rated coming in.
Yeah, for sure. It only had a 117 race rating coming into the race. And, that's not strong for a grade 3. And particularly when you figure that was largely on the back of the figures that Straight No Chaser had earned. Without him, we'd probably be talking something like a 112 race rating, which is particularly weak.
And I do want to quickly mention game effort by the runner-up 90% Maddie, who's sort of an overachiever based at Parks with Butch Reed. Butch Reed came to play on Saturday at Aqueduct, sending out the upset winner of the Bogey and nearly causing another upset in this run. Happy just falling a neck short after getting a very good ride from Irad Ortiz, but he would have won with a very good trip if he had gotten up. Let's move on to one race from Churchill on Saturday. Not the stakes event, but actually a high-level allowance race that went as the 9th race on their Saturday card, which featured the return of Hit Show, who was the Grade 3 Withers winner from last year, had competed in the Wood Memorial. I think the beaten favorite in that race, came back and ran respectably in races like the Kentucky Derby and Belmont Stakes, and maybe didn't really pan out in the second half of the season. He was last seen actually near you, Craig, in the Oklahoma Derby, went to the sidelines thereafter, but now coming back off the layoff to kick off his 4-year-old campaign. And I think he got things started the way that you'd want to see.
Yeah, he was a horse that ran a decent race, ran a solid 5th in the Kentucky Derby last year, only beaten just over 2 lengths in the Belmont, but things went downhill after that. Didn't show up in the Jim Dandy, didn't really even show up in the Oklahoma Derby. Got some time off, but I like what I saw from him in this return race. He ran a nice speed figure here, 118, and it's a division that's not the strongest. So if he could progress off of that number, which I would fully expect him to as a pretty likely race 4-year-old, he could make some noise in the stakes division.
Yeah, I thought he got a very good trip, but he finished up this race the way that you'd want to see, getting that solid 118 Timeform US speed figure. I think that's the best he had earned before. I think his previous high was a 117 in the Kentucky Derby. So some nice, if modest, progression for Hit Show, and he's going to face tougher allowance fields down the line because horses like Alexander Helios and Warrior Johnny are not going to be confused with graded stakes winners. But it was just a good start to the campaign for this horse, and I think that we're going to see him probably try stakes company in his next start. Let's move on to a race from Southern California on Sunday. Their feature race at Santa Anita was the Las Barrera, the 4th race on their card out west. Only a 4-horse field in this one, Craig. The heavy favorite was Ball Don't Lie, going up for Mark Glatt, who was coming off a very fast maiden victory in the second start of his career. I think he had debuted in that fast maiden event won by Vlahos, who ran respectably in the Pat Day Mile, even though fading at the end of that race. But it was actually the second choice in the wagering, the number 2, Tapalo, going out for John Sadler, a horse that we had seen in the Santa Anita Derby, setting the pace before fading. Turned back in distance to 7 furlongs, really seemed to work for Tapalo.
Yeah, he certainly enjoyed that cutback. He didn't just win this race. He kind of blew this field away. So a big effort from him. Maybe it was the turn back in distance. Hard to say. I don't have a Timeform US speed figure for this one yet, but I think it's going to be pretty big. I projected at about 119. I'll have that posted on the app formerly known as Twitter later tonight or early tomorrow morning to say what it is for sure. But in any case, it was a big effort, just 4 horses, but it was a fast race. Good effort from him. And I would imagine we'll be seeing him in some stakes. And it's a figure that was fairly easy to make, I would imagine, which is why I bother with the projection. There was a race later on the card around one turn that we're not going to talk about, but it was won by a very fast horse who ran a similar speed figure and had those kind of numbers coming in. So I think this is going to be a fast race and look forward to seeing this guy again. I'm going to assume they're going to keep him at one turn.
Yeah, I'll be interested to see if he's able to step up against tougher competition. I don't think they're going to do it in his next start, because I was reading the post-race article on DRF.com from John Sadler saying that since Tapolo actually is a New York bred, they're thinking about coming for that Mike Lee Stakes after Belmont Stakes Day, where who knows, maybe you could meet up with the wine steward. So I think they'll probably try that maybe slightly softer spot before moving on and thinking about graded stakes company in the future in sprint races. And I kind of wonder what he might be able to do against some tougher foes in these one-turn races, Craig, because as you could see in this replay, he really never took a challenge. He just got out to the front end, was in front the entire way. The favorite Ball Don't Lie, for whatever reason, didn't run his A race, didn't run back to the speed figure that he had earned breaking his maiden. And Tapolo just never really got a challenge. The other two in this race just not quite competitive. So I'm a little skeptical of the number like this earned in the fashion that it was. But like you said, seems legitimate based on the other dirt races this day. We'll just see if he's able to reproduce it in a race that features a more competitive pace scenario. Let's talk about one more race from last weekend. That was the feature race from Monmouth Park on Saturday. It was the 7th race on the card, the Long Branch Stakes for the 3-year-olds. Another one, Craig, the speed figure's not in the system yet, but I think you have it for C Streak, the winner of this race. And we just talked about a New York bred winning in California. Well, this more appropriately is a New Jersey bred winning in New Jersey. And a son of C Wizard, a local New Jersey sire, winning the Long Branch Stakes. It just seems fitting.
Yeah, I don't think there's a whole lot of New Jersey breds out there anymore. They just don't race as much in the state, but it's good to see that there's a pretty good one out there in C Streak. And he had shown some talent when he was second to the talented Knightsbridge, distant second at Gulfstream, but he kind of backed that number up here. He's going to get a 112 Timeform US speed figure. The final time was a 115 in here. So good, strong effort by him, and not sure where he's going to go next. This wasn't the strongest field that you're ever going to see, but he certainly did it the right way.
Yeah, this horse is just easy to root for. He's an overachiever. He was, I think, second to Bookham Dano when he made his debut in a stakes race last year as a 2-year-old in a very fast New Jersey bred stakes race. And this was just his second victory since that time, but definitely a convincing score. I mean, there were some horses in this race going out for top barns, like the runner-up Heartened, and C Streak was just superior every step of the way. You could see coming around the turn. He's not the biggest horse in the world, but he just travels really strongly. He's got his ears pricked at this point, and he just was always traveling in hand for Jairo Rendon, is able to run away from this field for trainer Eddie Owens. And these Sea Wizards, Craig, I don't know how much you follow Monmouth, but they can run. There haven't been too many of them. It's kind of like that New York sire Slumber, who's only had a handful of progeny, but a couple of them are graded stakes winners. And it's a similar situation with Sea Wizard in New Jersey. C Streak, definitely the most accomplished of them so far, but I think there was another one that won a stakes at Gulfstream over the winter time. So I'll be interested to see if there are more Sea Wizards popping up in future seasons.
Yeah, that'll be definitely something to keep an eye on.
Well, let's transition from Pacecast mode now to forecast mode as we look ahead to the second jewel of the Triple Crown on Saturday at Pimlico. And I will share the DRFPPs of the Preakness Stakes, which is race 13 on Saturday at Pimlico. And we'll take a look at the TimeformUS PPs to begin, because I think one of the ways that we should start talking about this Preakness, Craig, is to look at the TimeformUS Pace Projector, because it's an interesting pace projector to talk about, I think, given the horses that could be involved in the pace. Two Bob Baffert trainees likely to attract a lot of support in this race, but also two of the main pace players. One of those, of course, being the morning line favorite Muth, the other, the number 9 Imagination. I think one of the interesting things about the post position draw for the Preakness is that Muth is drawn inside of Imagination. And just looking at these two horses and their past performances and running styles coming into the race, you would probably expect, like the pace projector shows, that Imagination is the slightly faster of the two and the one that has has more of the aptitude to be a front runner. But with Muth drawn inside of Imagination, I wonder if Bob Baffert is going to want to have that one cross over in front of his favorite Muth in the early stages, and or if Juan Hernandez is going to be instructed to sort of come running away from the gate, go forward, and sort of take up that position on the inside of Imagination. Maybe those two together can dictate terms to the rest of the field, because it does feel like Bob Baffert, to some extent, is going to be able to control the pace of this Preakness.
Yeah, I think that's pretty undeniable here. I think it's interesting that this pace projector doesn't have a flag expecting the pace to be fast. And I'm glad, because I agree with it. But the pace projector doesn't take into account that the two horses with the TimeformUS running style of speed are both trained by the same guy. And I think there will be some strategy involved. I had to write an article for Daily Racing Form about this pace projector. And the one thing I said that maybe I didn't agree with, I mostly do agree with this pace projector. I think it's pretty much nailed it in here. But if there was going to be one change, it would be that maybe Muth is up closer to the leader or even inside. If he's going to stay inside, I think he's going to be on the lead. The last thing you want to do is be inside behind your stablemate, let other horses get in and kind of box you in. So I think a lot's going to depend on the break. There's obviously a long run to the first turn at Pimlico for 1 mile and 3/16. So strategy is going to come into play. I could see either one of the two leading. It just kind of depends on the break. But I agree with you. I don't think it would be ideal for the 9 Imagination to cross over if there's other horses coming with him.
Yeah, I'll just be interested to see what happens. I don't think that this pace is going to be so slow that it's going to take other horses completely out of the race. I don't think that horses like Mystic Dan and Catching Freedom are going to be so compromised by them crawling up front like we saw with National Treasure last year, where there really was nobody to press him in the early stages. I mean, there are horses with tactical speed in this race, and you just ran through them with a good summary, Craig. So I think we're going to see at least an honest pace in this Preakness, but I don't think that it's going to be nearly as fast as the pace that we saw develop in the Kentucky Derby. Not that Mystic Dan is a horse that needs a fast pace to be successful. I think one of the aspects of his Derby that maybe is getting somewhat overlooked, Craig, is that he was not the beneficiary of the pace. He was actually relatively close to that pace in the early stages, certainly much closer than everybody else that finished in the top 5 in the Kentucky Derby. I mean, I'll show the chart once again. We talked about it when we did the recap on the TimeformUS Pacecast after the Kentucky Derby, but of the top 5 finishers, Mystic Dan was the only one that was anywhere near the early leaders in the opening half of that race. Half mile in, he was just over 2 3/4 lengths behind the leader, Track Phantom, and he had moved up to be just a length off them with about a half mile to go. Whereas the other horses that were involved in the finish were still 13th, 15th, 16th. It was a race that really fell apart behind Mystic Dan. So while he got that ground-saving trip, and that did benefit him in the end, as well as the fact that he really didn't have a straw in his path the entire way, I do think you have to give Mystic Dan some credit for hanging around when everybody else who was near the top 10 early in the Derby just kind of fell apart in the late stages.
Yeah, I mean, after 3/4 of a mile, he was 4th, just a length off the lead. The 3 horses in front of him finished 11th, 15th, and 17th. And that includes the race favorite Fierceness, who just wasn't able to handle it. Now, he's got some other quirks that probably contributed, but yeah, he ran a good race. One of my dreams as a speed figure maker that hopefully will come to fruition is someday I'll be able to incorporate ground loss into these speed figures along with pace, kind of make them a 3-dimensional figure. And people have argued that Sierra Leone and Forever Young ran the better races, better than Mystic Dan. I wouldn't really argue with them, but it's not like Mystic Dan didn't run well. Yes, he saved all the ground, but as you said, he was the only one anywhere close to that pace that finished well. He was nimble enough to get through a tight spot inside and make his own good trip. It's not like it just opened up for him and, the heavens parted and here he came. He made that trip because he's quick, he's athletic, and was able to get through. And he led for a long way. I mean, he took over before the mile mark and was able to hold off all those closers all the way to the wire. So I think he ran well. There are some questions about how he's coming into this race. Not questions, but maybe some concerns. But I don't want to discount Mystic Dan.
Yeah, I think if you're going to be against Mystic Dan in this Preakness, which seems like a valid stance to take, it's not because he didn't run well in the Kentucky Derby. I mean, you could say that he was just a lucky winner of the Kentucky Derby, but as you were alluding to, I don't think that's fair. I mean, when you take into account the pace and measure it against ground loss for Sierra Leone and Forever Young, maybe Mystic Dan was third best in terms of his effort on the day, but I don't think it's so clear. I think the top three all ran really strong races, and whether the pace mattered more than the ground loss is really hard to say. If you're against Mystic Dan, or at least I would say if I'm against Mystic Dan, it's because I have some concerns that he's not going to run as well coming back in 2 weeks. Whereas maybe some other horses in this field that are coming back from the Kentucky Derby really didn't have to. Their connections just sort of decided that they're going to because it's to their benefit. Mystic Dan has that pressure of being the Derby winner, and I'm sure that Ken McPeek could have said to the owners, the horse just isn't doing great. He's really knocked out. It's going to be in the best interest to wait until the Belmont or a later target. But there's a lot of pressure on these connections to run back in the Preakness when you are the Derby winner. And we've seen some skip it in the past, but by and large, the Derby winner does run back in the Preakness. And if they're doing well, they run well, but they're not always doing as well 2 weeks later. And a horse like Mystic Dan, I think you have to be a little bit concerned because his trainer, Ken McPeek, has said that he's mildly concerned that the one time this horse ran back in 2 weeks didn't run as well. He had run back on relatively short rest when he broke his maiden. I think that was 3 weeks from his debut race. But when he had those two big starts under his belt and then came back 13 days later for that allowance race as a 2-year-old, didn't show up there. So I think you have to be mildly concerned about that, Craig, especially because the other knock against Mystic Dan is that even if you think he ran well in the Kentucky Derby, he's kind of a last time was the time horse. He was 18-1 in the Derby, and you kind of missed the opportunity that day. And whatever price is going to be in the Preakness, it's going to be a fraction of that, whether it's 5-2, 3-1, second choice. You're kind of jumping onto the bandwagon after everybody else already made their fortune 2 weeks ago. So I think those are valid reasons to be against Mystic Dan, but not because he was some fluky Derby winner.
No, not at all. I can remember a similar horse, Charismatic, winning at a big price in the Derby. And that was one I actually bet back in the Preakness, but he went off at 8-1. And I thought his Derby was completely legitimate, just like I think Mystic Dan's was legitimate. But he's not going to be 8-1. He's going to be 2-1, 5-2. And this also is not your typical Preakness that we've seen the last few years. You're not going to find a Preakness where a easy winner of the Arkansas Derby is coming in fresh off that race. The runner-up in the Santa Anita Derby is coming in fresh from that race because these horses almost always show up in the Kentucky Derby, but they weren't allowed this year. And I do think it gives him a bit of an advantage. Ken McPeek, if he's hesitant, he's a guy that loves to run his horses. I think bettors have every right to be a little bit hesitant. He mentioned that the horse came back in 2 weeks one other time and didn't run particularly well. That was in fall of his 2-year-old season. He did stretch out quite a bit that day from 5.5 furlongs to a mile. Maybe that had something to do with it, but that concern is there. And like I said, if Ken McPeek has a little concern, I can see why bettors would as well.
Well, let's talk about his main rival, who's likely to be the clear favorite in this race, Muth, the horse that you were talking about, coming in fresh after winning that Arkansas Derby quite convincingly, Craig. And I think if you're just comparing the form lines of that race, Muth looks pretty appealing because he beat Mystic Dan by over 6 lengths. And coming in off that performance, now 2 for 2 as a 3-year-old. I mean, it looks like the horse that's fresh and ready to take advantage of the opportunity for Bob Baffert, who we know can have success in the Preakness with this kind of horse, pulling off a similar feat last year with National Treasure. And years prior to that, no matter how he's coming into the race, Bob Baffert can win the Preakness. So Muth is the horse to beat in this race, Craig. I've seen a lot of talk that, this race is just being served up on a silver platter to Muth, that he can't possibly lose. Prices around 6-5, even money is fair. I don't know if I view him as having that kind of edge on this field, even though I do think he probably is the most likely winner, Craig. It's sort of hard for me to gauge how good this Arkansas Derby that we're going to watch now really is compared to what some of the horses coming out of the Kentucky Derby produced, like Mystic Dan and Catching Freedom, who who put forth that Derby effort against the best 3-year-olds outside of maybe Muth, that showed up at the first Saturday in May. And Muth, while he ran against a solid field in Arkansas, he hasn't really gotten that test. I think this Preakness is a tougher race than what he's coming out of.
I do agree it's a tougher race. I had his Arkansas Derby fast. I don't think the Beyer team had the race quite as fast, if memory serves. The one thing I'll say is after the replay, if you could pull up the chart, it's been a pretty strong race coming back. Obviously, Mystic Dan went on to win the Kentucky Derby, Informed Patriot, and I think it was Imperial Gun ran 1-2 in the Bathhouse Row Stakes, backing up the speed figures they ran that day. Even Will Take It came back to win, and Dymatic, who ran last that day, came back to win 2 starts later, running very similar speed figures. So I do think it was a fast race. I have no argument that he had a pretty easy trip this day, just basically clear all the way around. Wasn't really challenged much through the lane. But there's also the very real possibility that he's going to get a similar trip here because, as we said, Bob Baffert's probably going to control the pace. We kind of glossed over it a little bit, but the 2 horses on the pace projector shown in behind are both Wayne Lucas type horses, or both Wayne Lucas trained horses who I don't think are going to be eager to take on the Bob Baffert horses. So I do think Matt Muth is clearly the horse to beat in this field, despite facing the Kentucky Derby winner.
I think he's the horse to beat too, Craig. I don't know that I want to bet him in this race, though, because I do feel like there's this sense out there that he's just going to win this race. And I don't know if it's going to be that easy. The one thing about the Arkansas Derby that's a little tough for me to square is that he got a very similar trip to Just Steel. Just Steel basically just followed Muth every step of the way. And he beat him by 2 lengths. And I know that the pace was hot in the Derby, but Just Steel came back and really stunk in that race. I mean, he was done before Track Phantom and Fierceness coming around the far turn. He really dropped out soon. So maybe Just Steel is just an inconsistent horse, and you can't really expect him to carry his form from one race to another. But I do worry a little bit that Muth really had things his own way in Arkansas, and maybe he's going to get another good trip here because he's just that kind of horse that has the tactical speed that can work out a good trip for himself. I just get the sense he's being a little overrated. Like I said, I think Muth is the most likely winner. I think he's the most likely winner at around 28-30%, 5-2 odds. And I don't think I'm going to get that on Muth in this Preakness. So for that reason, I'm kind of looking at some other options. But he's not a horse that I'm taking some big stand against in terms of leaving him completely out. Because, like I said, I think he is pretty likely to win this race. I guess while we're talking about the Arkansas Derby, Craig, I mean, since I brought up Just Steel, what's your take on him? Because he is one of the more difficult horses to read in this Preakness.
Well, I'll do a spoiler alert. I actually picked him second when we get to our selections because I think that Derby trip was a little tougher than you can just blow it off as he was terrible because he was right up there, taken out of his running style pretty much completely, the one that he's shown of late anyway, at least in 2024, where he likes to kind of track the pace. He didn't get out of the gate that well, and he's a horse that races a lot. And I've just seen this with Wayne Lucas horses. They'll throw in clunkers, and it doesn't matter. He runs them right back, and a lot of times they'll run right back to their numbers. So I like the jockey change to Joel Rosario. I know he hasn't been riding as well, though in 2024, he's been better, I think, than what we saw from him last year. And I think he's going to give this horse a shot. So I picked him second. As you said, I don't think Muth is going to offer any value. He's the horse I put on top. I may very well wind up betting Just Steel. And it's just kind of faith in Wayne Lucas running his horses and knowing that sometimes they throw in clunkers because they run so often. And I think he's sitting on a pretty good race.
Yeah, I wasn't quite sure what to do with him, Craig. I'll say that I went into handicapping this Preakness expecting to like him more than I did. And I went back to watch that Kentucky Derby, and I sort of had forgotten how early Just Steel was completely finished in that race. I mean, they're coming down the backstretch, and you could see Keith Asmussen already kind of shaking the reins at him like, uh-oh, I'm losing ground to catching free to track Phantom and Fierceness, and like by the time they're heading into the turn, he's finished. I mean, he didn't even make it to the mile before he was out of the race. So I don't know. He for me, he ran pretty poorly in the Derby. Even with the pace excuse, I was expecting to see a little more from him. His Arkansas Derby was really good, though. I mean, I was viewing as a horse that you could use in exotics in the Kentucky Derby based on that. And maybe he just is that inconsistent horse that doesn't show up from race to race. And now he's going to be a much bigger price. So I get taking the more positive view of him, Craig. He's just hard for me to trust. And I think that there are some horses in here that I'm expecting to show up that won't be as big of a price as Just Steel. I just have a little more faith in them. So I couldn't quite get there with him, but I understand where you're coming from. Well, while we're talking about the Kentucky Derby horses, Craig, let's wrap up the 3 coming out of the Kentucky Derby and move on to Catching Freedom. This horse, he was with the race flow in the Derby because he was way back early, was part of that massive horses making a big late rally, though he got a very different trip to horses like Sierra Leone and Forever Young, because Flavian Pratt, I thought, did a good job just saving ground every step of the way. One critical part of the Derby that I think is missed a little bit is that Catching Freedom actually broke well and was coming away from the gate like a horse that might be in the top 10 heading under the wire the first time, because it actually was showing some speed. And as often happens in the Derby for horses that are drawn inside, they just came over on him and he didn't have to severely steady. He just got shuffled back mildly, repeatedly a few times to the point that he wound up all the way back in, where was he, 14th or 15th, heading around that clubhouse turn. But Catching Freedom, he actually was in the bridle early in the Derby and would have been a lot closer if not for that happening. After that, things just fell into place, saved all the ground, got a good trip, had to deal with a little more kickback in the late stages than maybe Sierra Leone and Forever Young did, trying to rally inside of horses and follow Mystic down. But he still finished up gamely, and I thought ran a nice race, Craig. And I guess the most interesting thing about Catching Freedom is that he's back in this field, because when I heard initially that Brad Cox was thinking about running him here, I was like, oh, it's just the talking point. There's no way he's running in the Preakness. And lo and behold, he's entered in the race, because it's really not Brad Cox's MO to run a horse back in 2 weeks. That said, Brad Cox is a pretty smart guy, and he knows that the Preakness is a winnable race for a lot of top 3-year-olds, and it's probably going to come up a softer spot than the Belmont Stakes, and it probably is wise to try to get your classic victory in Baltimore.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. I was a little surprised he was the one horse when I got back this weekend and saw the probables for the field. I was certainly not expecting to see him in there. I think it's a positive sign. I do worry if he's good enough, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong. He got a great trip in the Derby. I know you agree with that, given the circumstances, about as good as he could hope for. I still thought in the lane he was a little green and kind of fell back to his old tendencies of not really wanting to run straight. Not saying it would have won or even not finished 4th, but I still saw a little bit of unprofessionalism. So I wasn't a huge fan of that in there. And at the end of the day, there's still just some faster horses in here. I'm a little worried the pace isn't going to flatter him very much. Now, maybe he'll lay closer if he gets out of the gate like he did in the Derby, because obviously not such a big field. But this race seems like it just doesn't fit him. It's not one that everything would have to go his way, and I don't really see that happening.
I mean, what I'll say about him running through the stretch in the Derby is that Catching Freedom is never the prettiest mover. He sort of runs with his head not fully stuck out, like he's not fully extending himself. I mean, sort of think the opposite of the way that Sierra Leone moves. To me, it looked typical for him in the Kentucky Derby. That's just him. He wasn't swapping leads. I don't recall that, at least, the way that we had seen, like, per se in the Risen Star, where he was going back and forth to his right lead and left lead. I think he's gotten over a lot of that stuff. And I actually was encouraged by the race that he ran in the Kentucky Derby from a mental standpoint, the way that he handled the challenge of the Derby. It just seems like a horse that learned his lessons really well. And I take the fact that he's running here back as a positive too, Craig. And the point that I'm making about his running style is that when you look at him on paper, he looks like this deep closer. when you watch his races, you realize he's not this deep closer. He's actually more akin to the horse that ran in the Risen Star, where he was just 3 or 4 lengths off the pace early. That's where he wants to be. But unlike some other horses in this race who have been in small field after small field, Catching Freedom's been in 12, 11, 20 horse fields the last 3 times, and he's just gotten shuffled back a little bit. He's the only 2 horses that lack speed are drawn inside of him. So I think he's going to be a little closer to the pace than some people expect him to be in this Preakness. And I don't think he's going to be that compromised by however the pace develops. And I think I'm taking a more positive view of this horse than a lot of people appear to be. I don't see many people actually liking Catching Freedom in this race, Craig, and I don't quite get it. He ran almost as well as Mystic Dan in the Derby, and you could argue that the fact that he's running here is a more positive sign than Mystic Dan is, because it's not like the margin between them is that great. I don't know if the difference is going to be 6-1 and 5-2 on the line that I did for the race. I had them at 3-1 and 4-1, but maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe Catching Freedom is going to be a bigger price, and I don't know. I think he's kind of appealing in this race, but maybe I'm doing it differently from others because I'm missing something with this horse.
Yeah, I'm not sure what to make of where he's going to be. You cite the Risen Star, but I would say that was a race where there was absolutely no pace whatsoever. It was one that was so slow early, we had to do a pace upgrade. We did see he was within 4 lengths after, I guess, 3/4 of a mile in the Derby with that traffic issue. So, yeah, he's a wild card for me. If he's going to win this race, he's going to need to be up closer than what we've seen from him recently.
I think a horse that a lot of people are going to be upgrading in this race, Craig, is the number 8, Tuscan Gold. Look, he just fits an established pattern for Chad Brown. We saw it with Cloud Computing, horse that ran in a final round Derby prep, didn't quite do enough to get to the Kentucky Derby, waited for the Preakness and won. Same thing with early voting, exact same profile, won the Preakness. Almost pulled it off again last year at Blazing Sevens, who probably is a cut below those two, but still almost won the Preakness. And Tuscan Gold, I mean, he just fits the pattern to a T. Lightly raced horse, ran well in the final round Derby prep, not quite enough to get into the Derby. And Chad Brown just sat on him, bringing a fresh horse into the Preakness. Is it going to be the same thing again? It could be.
It could be. I didn't put this horse in my top 4, but I could have easily. It's not like I think he's going to run bad. I'm well aware of Chad Brown. I'm pretty sure I picked early voting in the Preakness, and he ran very well that day. Now, I thought he came in as with a better resume than what we see from Tuscan Gold, but make no mistake, this horse took a big step forward in the Louisiana Derby. He didn't run particularly fast when he romped in his maiden win, but the Louisiana Derby was pretty good. We've talked about it. It's been a pretty strong race coming out of it. Antiquarian is one who was well back in this race, and we saw what he did in Peter Pan. So I'm not going to throw a whole lot of shade Tuscan Gold's way because I think he's actually pretty good. Maybe he's got another forward step in him.
Yeah, I think the Louisiana Derby has held up pretty well. I mean, maybe the one horse you would say didn't run well that you were expecting out of that race was Honor Marie, but I mean, he's not back in here, but I mean, you could go back and watch his Kentucky Derby trip, and it was kind of a nightmare in the early stages. So probably not a true effort from him, but Catching Freedom came back and ran well in the Derby. Obviously, Track Phantom had the pace excuse, but even he didn't run that badly in the Derby, considering things. Yeah, I think it was a legitimate performance from Tuscan Gold. And while I know there's a narrative out there that the Louisiana Derby was some pace collapse race that you wanted to maybe upgrade the horses that were forward, I don't necessarily see it that way, Craig. I mean, it was a pretty even race from a pace figure standpoint. I just think that the top 2 finishers, Catching Freedom and Honor Marie, they probably just ran the best races. I don't think that they lucked into those trips because the pace fell apart. I just viewed them as maybe the 2 best horses on Louisiana Derby Day. I will say, though, Tuscan Gold, well, I'm not going to upgrade him for being close to the pace. He was wide around both turns. He was 3 to 4 wide on the first turn and 3 wide on the second turn. He had to come under a ride earlier than some other horses. It seemed like he was spinning his wheels coming around the far turn of that Louisiana Derby. And it looked for a brief second and upper stretch like he was going to back up to be in the second half of the field across the wire. But I think his stamina came through, and he just kept staying on to the wire. Kind of like a horse that you would be thinking would love 1.5 miles in the Belmont, except there is no 1.5 miles Belmont this year. So it's not going to set up for this horse that way. And maybe the Preakness will turn out to be the right race for him. he is kind of that one-paced grinding type, and we'll see if that's what is the style that's effective in this Preakness. I worry that, especially being 8-1 on the track morning line, that he's going to look really appealing to a lot of players, Craig, and he's going to end up being more like 9-2, 5-1 in this race. And at that price, it's a little low for me for a horse that I still think has some things to prove. But I respect the angle. I respect the connections for sure.
Yeah, and that's the reason I didn't put him in my top 4. Watching him, I don't think he has the brilliance of a horse like Early Voting. I think he's more of a grinder. When I saw his Louisiana Derby, of course, my mind didn't always remember everything, and I was thinking Belmont Stakes, not thinking that it's not a 1.25 miles this year, or not a 1.5 miles this year. It's just a 1.25 miles. But Chad Brown is trying him. If I was playing vertical tickets, he would be on my ticket somewhere. He wouldn't be an A, but I would definitely have him included.
What do you make of the other Bob Baffert runner in this race, Craig? Imagination, who really has not put forth a bad effort in 6 prior starts, kind of like Muth, never finishing out of the exacta, though he hasn't won quite as often as that foe. I would say that it's hard to gauge the quality of some of the races that he's exiting, particularly the San Felipe, where he just faced one other serious rival who was a Bob Baffert trainee. And the Santa Anita Derby, it came up okay in the Derby with Stronghold. Being somewhat involved in the pace, and then I think only getting beaten 12, 13 lengths in the end. I mean, I say only, it's the Kentucky Derby. That's not doing so badly. Obviously, Tapolo, who we just talked about, came out of that race to win the last Barrera, but did so on a significant turn back in distance. I'm just not sure what to make of the quality of the fields that Imagination's been beating or at least facing in his recent starts.
Yeah, that's the way I'm leaning as well. Maybe you could argue Tapolo, maybe he cost Imagination in the race with that sprint quality speed and kind of battling with him early, setting it up for Stronghold. But to me, Stronghold, he's just okay. He hadn't run any particularly fast races. He won that race in New Mexico, the Sunland Derby. He only got a 1:14 when he won the Santa Anita Derby. For me, it's just, I know a lot of times I'm the first one to joke about the other Brown or the other Pletcher, and certainly the other Baffert, because he wins with the lesser half of his non-coupled entries plenty. But I'm having a hard time making that leap here. I just don't think he's as good as Muth. I think there's a few lengths between them, and I don't envision a scenario where he would get such a good, better trip than Muth that he could beat that rival.
Yeah, I just don't see the high ceiling with this horse. He's pretty game. I mean, we've seen him be involved in some photo finishes and really try hard, like he's trying to come back on Stronghold and here in the Santa Anita Derby replay that we're looking at. But I just don't know that he has the brilliance to win a race like the Preakness. And I not that he's in here only to help Muth, Craig, because I don't think that's the case, but I do think it's never a bad thing when you're a trainer that has 2 horses with tactical speed and they both are legitimate win contenders and they have the quality to stick around for a long time and they can sort of dictate how the race goes for everybody else in the field. I think it's only going to be to the benefit of both horses. So I don't like Imagination, but I think his presence in here is a slight bonus for Muth. That's kind of how I'm viewing it. And I find it harder to be against Muth because Imagination is in the race. Maybe that's a better way to put it. As for others, Craig, I mean, we covered the main contenders. The other Lucas horse, Sees the Gray, a horse that won the Pat Day Mile last time. Personally, I didn't think that was a particularly strong edition of that race. Certainly the speed figure didn't come up that fast. Uncle Heavy, the horse coming out of the Wood Memorial, was well beaten that day, albeit from a wide post, but it's going to have to run better. And then Mugatu just seems like taking a wild shot. Any of those of any interest to you, or they just feel like filler in this field?
No, I'm curious to see what Sees the Gray is going to do early. He seems like the one horse that could maybe mess up any Baffert plans of controlling the front end, but I wasn't impressed that much with the Pat Day Mile. When I made the speed figures, it was frankly a disappointing race. I wouldn't even say he ran the best race. He ran fine. Don't get me wrong. He kind of was up there on that fast paced drop back. I would say it was more of a good ride by Christian Torres than it was some great effort by the horse. The others, yeah, Uncle Heavy, he's another that maybe he would seem like a Belmont type horse in a regular Belmont year, but this isn't a regular Belmont year. He doesn't really have a fast race on his resume yet. And he's a horse who would probably need some pace. It's a lot of pace that he's not going to get in here. And even if he did, he would still have to outkick horses like Mystic Dan and Uncle Heavy, or not Catching Freedom. And just not sure he has that in him. Mugatu, not really sure what he's doing in the race. I mean, he got beat in the Bluegrass at 99-1 while never really being a factor. So he's not for me.
Well, Craig, let's give it our picks. We'll do a Preakness video that's probably a little more concise than this later in the week that you'll find on DRF's YouTube channel. We can get our picks as well, but we can verbalize them here too, since we already had to submit them for the print edition. Craig, I think you already gave away where you're leaning, so I'll let you go first.
Yeah, I put Muth on top. I think he's a little more likely to win. I have him probably 45 to 50%. He's still not going to be worth betting, most likely. I put Just Steel second. He's probably the one I'm going to try to make money on by getting him in the top two of this race. Third, I think I put Mystic Dan. I don't have him in front of me. I think he ran fine in the Derby. I think he's going to run fine here. And Catching Freedom fourth. No real big surprises for me. If I'm betting the race, though, Just Steel would be my key horse to try to cash.
Yeah, and for me, look, I struggled with this race. It's one where I don't feel a strong attraction to anybody. It was sort of a struggle to push myself to make a pick. And it's not a race that I'm not looking forward to betting it as much as I was the Kentucky Derby. But I put Catching Freedom on top. I just feel like no one's giving him the credit for as well as he ran in the Kentucky Derby. And I get it. He didn't run quite as well as the top three, but two of those three are not back in here. And I think the fact that he's running in this race is maybe a bigger positive than Mr. Dan coming back to run in the Preakness. So I just expect him to come back and run well once again. He had a pretty light schedule up to this. I think he had consistently 5 to 6 weeks between starts, 6 weeks ahead of the Kentucky, or I think it was 5 weeks ahead of the Kentucky Derby. And now he's back in here. So, I mean, I think he's going to run well. Whether the pace is going to work for him, I don't know. But I think he does have more tactical speed than some people give him credit for. And I just think he's going to be the right price. Whether he's 9-2, 5-1, I'm on board with Catching Freedom. The other horse I was strongly considering is Tuscan Gold. I just would want more around that 6, 7, 8-1 on him, and I don't think he's going to be that price. So he's my second pick, and then I put Muth third. Like I said, I think he's the most likely winner, just not really looking to bet him in this race, and Mystic Dan fourth. Even I have a lot of respect for Mystic Dan. I didn't get on board in the Derby. I'm not going to get on board now, but they could be horses that I could use with Catching Freedom.
Yeah, I did Catching Freedom. It was 6 weeks. The Louisiana Derby is the first of those big 100-point races. So he certainly should be pretty fresh for coming in on 2 weeks.
Well, those are our opinions on the Preakness. Like I said, Craig and I will be out with another video later in the week. But as far as the TimeformUS podcast go, that's going to be it this week as we sort of combined the Pacecast and the forecast. And definitely looking forward to this weekend, Craig, because like we were saying earlier, seemed for a while like maybe this Preakness wasn't coming up that strong. The race actually came together into a pretty interesting second leg of the Triple Crown. So I'll be intrigued to see how it plays out.
Yeah, I was very pleasantly surprised when I saw the field, and I haven't really dug into the rest of the card. I'm looking forward to it. I really wish I could make it this year. Baltimore is my hometown. I always love going back, but can't quite pull it off. But shout out Baltimore. It will always be home for me no matter where I live.
Well, everybody, thanks for tuning in to the TimeformUS Pacecast this week. Remember, you can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Everyone, thanks for tuning in. Craig and I will be back next week with a recap of the Preakness.